Hello and welcome, word nerds, to DIY MFA Radio, the show that will help you write more, write better, write smarter. I'm Gabriela Pereira, instigator of DIY MFA and your host for this podcast. Now let's talk writing. Hello, word nerds. Gabriela here, and welcome back to DIY MFA Radio. Our show notes are over at DIYMFA.com/388. because it's episode 388. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe on Apple, Google, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or, all the usual places where you might listen to a podcast. And please leave us a review. This will help other word nerds out there discover the show as well. Now, today I have the pleasure of interviewing Sasha Black. Sasha is an author, rebel podcaster, and professional speaker. She has 5 obsessions: words, expensive shoes, conspiracy theories, self-improvement, and breaking the rules. Sasha writes books about people with magical powers and other books about the art of writing. And we're going to be talking about one of her latter books in this interview. When she's not writing, she can be found laughing inappropriately loud, sniffing musty old books. Ah, yes, love that old book smell. Fangirling about film and TV soundtracks, and thinking up new ways to break the rules. She lives in Cambridgeshire, England, with her wife and genius giant of a son. Welcome, Sasha. It is so great to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor because I've sort of admired you from afar for a long time. We've spoken on the Rebel Author podcast and sort of had some dealings in the industry. So yeah, it's an absolute honor to get to speak to you today.
I feel like it's about dang time that we had you on the show. I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm super excited to be talking to you about your latest book on the craft, which is, as you know, obviously, about supporting characters or side characters, whatever we want to call them. I generally refer to them, FYI, as supporting, but listeners know what we're talking about. So before we dive on in, I like to hear about the story behind the story. But in this case, I kind of want to hear about the story behind the subject matter. Like, what the heck possessed you to write about supporting characters? Like, what drove you to this subject?
So it's an interesting one, really, because I never really intended to write about writing. So it's a little bit convoluted, but essentially I'm a bit senile and I have mum brain, and I'm also a perpetual learner. So I love learning, but I have to write these things down or I forget them. So I sort of started blogging, and some of the blogs had an awful lot of traffic. And I was like, oh, other people are finding this interesting and useful. So I wrote the first book and turned these blogs into a book, and then wrote another one. And those first 2 books were villains and heroes. And it's interesting, really, because I never intended to write about side characters, but it's what my audience asked for. And I try to choose books in sort of one of 2 ways, or topics for books in one of 2 ways. Either it's something that I am desperate to learn about, and I want to just dive into everything I can possibly learn, research, deconstruct from books, and share the enthusiasm basically for the topic that I have. Or it comes from the audience. So The Anatomy of Prose was one that was a passion project for me that sort of came out of editing and teaching people the same lessons over and over again, and sort of a little bit of frustration that I was having to teach the same lessons. And then Side Characters was very much a request from my audience. And, they were saying, well, you've done one on villains, you've done one on heroes. Actually, Side Characters hasn't really been covered. And when I went and looked at the market and I tried to find content on side characters, there actually really wasn't anything. There's lots of books about characters and how to create characters, but not those supporting roles specifically. So when I looked at it and I started kind of studying it, I was a bit reluctant because I wasn't really sure the angle that I would come from. And it wasn't until I was deep into kind of studying and researching that I really found that actually most of the conversation is about archetypes. And I don't really feel that archetypes is a helpful way to look at side characters when you're trying to create them from the ground up. So I decided to write the book from the angle of like side character importance and kind of connection to the protagonist and like their role in the story. So it wasn't until I'd found that hook and the angle that I wanted to come from that I could really dive into writing the content of the book.
Don't you love it when the audience just tells you what to produce for them? Like, it makes me so happy because I'm like, tell me what to do and I can follow orders, you know? And like, even though I'm a rebel too, but there's a part of me that's like, I don't even have to worry because you asked for it, which I don't know. I love that. So kudos for having an engaged audience that requested specifically this book. That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it was the first time that they'd kind of outright, there was an overwhelming, this is the topic that we want. It does have to be a blend of something that I'm interested in and something that they want. But it was just this very well-timed sort of happenstance, if you like.
Love it. So let's dive into supporting characters. And I'm going to keep calling them supporting characters because that's just what's in my brain. That's how I refer to them. We all know what we mean, the same thing.
Yeah.
But you referenced that there are main types of supporting characters. So what are those main types or categories or groupings? And what do we do with them?
So I like to break side characters or supporting characters down into three. And it's kind of in terms of their importance in the book, the amount of page time they get, and the amount of depth that you have to give them. So I just made up some terminology and just called them cameos, minor or major characters. So cameos are these brief flashes in the pan, much like in a movie. My favorite cameo in a movie, other than Stan Lee in the Marvel universe, who was the sort of graphic novel writer who popped up for about 10 seconds in the films, is from The Matrix. And there was a lady in a red dress and she doesn't say anything. She has about 20 seconds of footage, but you remember her because she's so stark and vivid and the role that she sort of plays in the film. But that's it. She doesn't have any subplots. Literally this 10 to 20 second appearance. She doesn't have any dialogue. She doesn't leave any impact or imprint on the story particularly. You could take her out of the story and it would make no difference. You could, replace her with somebody else or just remove it and you wouldn't really lose anything from the story. So cameos, they don't have subplots. They don't really need backstories. Most of the time, they actually just have these very generic labels like woman in the red dress or girl with the teddy. Then you have minor characters, and these are the ones that I think people often struggle with because they aren't cameos, but they also aren't major side characters. And these characters will have interactions with the protagonist and the main characters, but they'll be very transactional. So they're not sort of there to have a subplot or a backstory role, but they might be there multiple times. So these are the kinds of characters like, if you take Harry Potter, and I know lots of people have an issue with J.K. Rowling now, but the story is still solid as an example. If you take Mr. Filch, he is a minor character. You could take him out and it wouldn't affect the story. But actually, he's there. He sometimes causes problems, or the cat actually, his cat causes problems. And he's got quite a distinctive look about him. You remember and recall him from the film. You probably remember him in the book because he's this sort of creepy, leery sort of character. But you don't really know anything about his background. There isn't really any subplots that he's massively involved in, but he does get some page time. So Mr. Filch is an example. And another one would be like Wheezy from Toy Story, or I'm trying to think, like maybe Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, or is it, I think her name's Madge or Magda from the Hunger Games, the book.
Oh yeah, Madge,
that's it. Yeah. So there's a couple of examples.
Or Mag or something.
Max, yeah. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. And then, so major characters are the big leagues of side characters or supporting roles. So they are full of depth. They're three-dimensional. They may even have a point of view or narrate parts of the story. They more often than not will have to have subplots. They usually have character arcs as well. There is not that many of them because they require so much depth and page time. You only want a small handful of these characters, really. I mean, unless you're like George R.R. Martin, and because I hate to say anything prescriptive because you can always find examples of where people have done it and broken the rules and it's fine. And the other big part of these side characters is that they should represent the theme in some way, shape, or form. And so, yeah, they take up a lot of page time. They have meaningful interactions with the protagonist. They may be there to either hinder the protagonist or help the protagonist. They may be there to help the protagonist reflect or to grow or put obstacles in the way. So, yeah, that's kind of like the core differences for me between supporting roles.
So let's tease these apart a little bit more, because in addition to what sort of the level of intensity, I almost think of what you described, the cameos, minor and major characters, as being almost like the amplitude. But there are also characters that serve different purposes in the story, right? Like character that's more of a mentor advisor versus a buddy friend or a love interest, etc. So can you talk a little bit about the purpose that different types of supporting characters may have in a story?
Yeah, absolutely. So like that aspect is more often known as like the archetypes. But I think the common mistake that people make with archetypes is thinking that they are fixed. Whereas I think the structure that we've just spoken about, so the cameo, the minor, and the major, is more fixed because it's the amount of detail, depth, and the level of work you have to put into these characters. The archetypes aren't fixed. So archetypes include things like the guide or the mentor. Some good examples are like Gandalf or
Dumbledore.
Yes, exactly. I nearly called him Voldemort, but no, Dumbledore. And Haymitch from the Hunger Games. And then, you have like the best friend, often called the ally. And those are like the Ron and Hermiones of the world. And then you have obstacles, characters that come and put barriers in the way. And then you have like messenger characters, somebody who comes and delivers a message, like the Oracle in the Matrix. You have characters who are there for sort of comedic purposes and to lighten. Often you find them in books that have a darker side to them, and they'll often have like some kind of Joker type character in there who will just bring light to the story to help the reader kind of deal with those darker subjects. The thing is, these roles are not static. These roles can come and go. So you could have a best friend character who also puts an obstacle in the way,
right,
because that's real. And sometimes we have arguments with our best friends, and sometimes they want things that we don't want. And so, yeah, I think the best way to look at archetypes is in terms of like a hat that a character wears. It puts the hat on for a while, it plays that role, and sometimes that's the only role it plays in the whole story. And other times it will take that hat off and it will play a different role in the story. So that's how I see them differently. One is more of a hat that goes on and off. It's kind of like a mask or a role that the character is playing, like an actor. And the other one is the amount of work, the intensity, and kind of what structural elements you have to give that character.
I love that distinction. And I totally agree with you, by the way, that the archetypes are not fixed. In fact, sometimes you have characters who serve more than one archetype or move from one to another. Sometimes you have more than one character that fills a particular archetype, right? And sometimes you have them like pass the baton, like you have a surrogate character. Like I'm thinking, for instance, the character Rue in the Hunger Games, who kind of becomes a surrogate Prim to Katniss.
Yes.
And we kind of need that relationship, and Katniss needs that for the development of her character. But obviously it would defeat the purpose of her volunteering if Prim came into the games with her. So there's so many different ways that the archetypes kind of adjust themselves. So I love that idea of like they're wearing different masks or garb as the story goes on and as is required of them. So I'm curious, as we're developing these characters, particularly if we're looking in terms of the intensity, obviously the amount of work that we put into a cameo is going to be much less than, say, a major supporting character. But I'm guessing there may be certain things in common in terms of what you need to do, like the character has to show up. And then I'm guessing that there are certain sort of tactics that we need to focus more on with the more intensive characters. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. So for your cameos, you can get away with a label, so to speak. They usually come because they have some kind of purpose. Maybe they're a guard holding the door open, or maybe they're a receptionist that needs to give them the wrong key, or they have some task or transactional thing that they have to do in the story. In terms of creating them, you don't need much more than a label: the receptionist, the henchman. Not that you would call it a henchman, but the bodyguard. And that's it, really. They can be forgettable. You don't need your readers to remember everything about every single character. Your minor characters, though, need to be slightly more memorable. So you do need some kind of description. And I'm probably going to get lots of gasps of breaths from listeners when I say this, because it's a little bit controversial, but you can almost get away with them being a bit more cardboard cutout, because they don't have the page time in order to create that depth. And therefore, if you have these characters who are a bit more gregarious, maybe they have one key characteristic about them that's very overt, then you almost create the illusion of character depth in doing that, because they're only there for, a page or maybe 5 separate pages across the length of the book. So you do need some kind of character description so that the reader can imagine them. If you can spend some time working on voice, maybe they're camp, or perhaps they're incredibly posh. You can exaggerate these elements slightly, because it will create some contrast between the protagonist and this character. And creating that contrast between them will give the illusion of depth, because you don't have the time to create depth with these guys. And that's okay. You don't need to, because we're not writing War and Peace here. When you find your major side characters, you need to understand how they represent the theme differently to your protagonist. So let's say your protagonist is representing, I don't know, say they want to save the people they love, and your theme is saving, for example. It's all about saving and looking after the ones that you love. Your side characters, your major side characters, should represent a different question in there, or a different angle on that. So maybe there's a character who's LGBT and they haven't come out to the people they love yet, and therefore their mental health is suffering. So their angle on the theme of saving the ones you love is saving himself and saving their mental health by coming out. So that's a different representation. Perhaps you have another character who represents saving the environment. Maybe they work for an environmental company, or maybe they work for a gas guzzling company. And that's a different angle on to save that kind of theme. So you should look at how each of these characters represents a theme. That's the first thing. Another thing you need to know with your major side characters is their why. And I like to think that major side characters have 3 different whys. So the first one is a protagonist why. Even though we love our side characters, and because we have a bit more flexibility with them, we often have the most fun writing them, because we don't have to stick to so many sort of character arc rules and things. They are really there for the protagonist. They are, as you've called them, the supporting characters. They're there as in a supporting role. And so you need to know, what is their function in relation to the protagonist? What is their role? Are they there as a positive? Are they there as a negative for the protagonist? Are they there to cause trouble? Are they there to make the protagonist think? Are they there to push the protagonist through the journey? I don't know, but they have some kind of why in relation to the protagonist. Now, the next why is their own life why. And this is a way of creating depth for your side characters. Because, of course, if you're writing, like, let's say you're writing only one point of view, you're not going to get to see the ins and outs of your side characters. And even if you have multiple points of view, you still have one character who's the primary protagonist. And so they will get the most page time. You'll get the most time in their head. So you need some kind of why outside of the protagonist. So maybe your character who works for the environment has some kind of competition that they want to go for, or maybe they're trying to get an active, some kind of campaign going. Now, if you can have this life why cause problems for the protagonist, or get in the way of something for the protagonist, or perhaps it helps the protagonist, then that creates this illusion that the character has a life outside of the protagonist. And that creates the sense of depth and as if they are an entity in and of their own right. And especially if you can get that interplay between the protagonist's core storyline and I guess like their life way and their mini subplots, then that really like helps to create that depth as well. And then the last one is a bit more detailed and sort of less relevant to creating the character, but it is a scene why. And if your major characters are in a scene, then they need a reason for being there. So often when I was editing, I would, see like say a group of 6 characters come in at the beginning of the scene, 3 or 4 would have a conversation and then all 6 would leave again. And sort of you had these 2 tacking on the back and they didn't really do anything and they didn't really say anything and I'd forgotten they even existed. So of course each character must be doing something, saying something, affecting something, impacting something, causing a problem, helping, solving something. They have to do something in every single scene if you're putting them there. So yeah, that's probably, I've talked for a little while, but hopefully that's a few different things at the different levels.
I love this idea of the different versions of why and like the story why or the character like to the protagonist why and then like their own life why and then the why are they even in the scene. I think that's just such a great way of thinking about it. Let's dig in a little further because, you've given us some great examples sort of in hypothetical, but I think it might help to give concrete examples that listeners might be familiar with. So one thing like I wanted to unpack is that idea of how a supporting character's life why can actually end up causing trouble for the protagonist's sort of goal or what have you, even if it's not necessarily a bad life why. The example that comes to mind is the fact that Peeta reveals that he's in love with Katniss and they are both going to have to kill each other because they're in the arena together. Can you talk a little bit about how even characters that seem to be friendly to the protagonist, like their own priorities can get in the way, cause problems for the protagonist, etc.?
Yeah, so another example that I really like is Hermione Granger in Harry Potter. Sort of her whole character arc is from this very arrogant, full of herself, intelligent girl who loves books and learning to this slightly more modest, really quite loyal, good friend. So at the beginning, they're not the greatest of friends and it takes this journey for them to become friends. And that sort of why, that sort of life why, her desire to be the best in her class, to have all of the knowledge, drives various different problems. She gets a subplot linked to a little device called a time turner, where she gets to go back in time to retake a class. So she can do more classes than is physically possible according to the laws of our realities. But what this does is it looks like she's hiding things from the protagonist because she disappears and then she reappears and she knows things that she shouldn't know. And so even though she's doing a positive thing and she's like learning all of this stuff and it's all about her, really, it can cause problems for Harry and it sort of upsets their friendship. But the thing is, later down the line, all of these bits of knowledge that she's picked up often leads to her being able to come up with a spell or being able to come up with some random tidbit of knowledge that she's come up with, that she's learned somewhere down the line, that helps them beat one of the mini villains or helps them create a potion that they need. So yeah, I think that is one of my favorite examples because it's so clearly about her. It's her character arc. She goes on this journey and what is all about her fulfilling this desire to be the best in her class and get all these good grades ends up actually helping Harry and Ron to defeat Voldemort in the end. Is that the kind of example that you were after?
Yeah. And to take it even a step further, I mean, the time turner example that you gave, it becomes a really pivotal piece of plot, like a plot device at the end of book 3, right? Like if it wasn't for the time turner, then the whole ending to book 3 would not happen. And as Dumbledore would say, perhaps 2 lives can be saved. And, Hermione knows what to do and she uses the time turner and helps Harry save the day. So yeah, I love this idea of the characters that are supporting characters that are allies, maybe trying to reach goals, but like as they do that, they can actually create more trouble for the protagonist. One thing that jumped out in what you just said was the idea of defeating mini villains. So if there's such a thing as mini villains, then clearly there has to be a super villain too. So can you discuss that distinction? Like, what is a mini villain?
Okay, well, if we're going to continue with Harry Potter.
Yes, please.
Yeah, that's probably the best example. So the super villain, the big bad villain, is always going to be Lord Voldemort. But in any good series, you don't defeat that villain. And well, it depends. So if you have a very long running series, you may have like mini arcs within the series. So like say you have 3 books and you might defeat a big bad villain at the end of book 3, and then you might defeat an even bigger villain at the end of book 6 or 10 or whatever. But along the way, you still need tension and conflict, and you still need your characters to be growing, and you still need them to be doing things and defeating things. Otherwise, you lose all of that tension, you lose all of the impetus for the readers to continue and to turn that page. So in Harry Potter, there is very low level sort of micro conflict between relationships between characters. Taken, for example, now I've forgotten his name, the guy who has the rabbit teeth, the sort of young one who pulls the sword out of Longbottom, Neville Longbottom. They freeze him and they do all of these things. But actually you have an antagonist as opposed to just giant villains in the form of Voldemort. So you have Draco Malfoy. He's an antagonist, and he's this low level of simmering irritation to Harry the entire way through the Harry Potter series. And then in each book, they're quite formulaic in that Voldemort is represented in some character, be it Dolores Umbridge. She's a problem in one of the books and is that sort of mini villain in that book. You have Mad Eye Moody, who is a mini villain. He's sort of the main villain in that particular book. But all the way through, threaded all the way through the whole of that is Voldemort. And so you often find this different levels of villainy in longer running series. Another example, like if you look at the Hunger Games, you've got President Snow, but you've also got the Capitol.
Right.
So like President Snow is the tangible embodiment of the Capitol, but it's also the Capitol that is kind of a villain too. And it's the whole society and structure that needs bringing down. But then you also have that embodied in President Snow. And then on an even smaller, like an even more granular level, you have each of the tributes. So she's got to fight all of these different tributes in the Hunger Games itself. And so each one of these creates a different level of conflict. And then you have like interpersonal conflict, and that's not villainy as such, but it is conflict creation. And, that's the tension between Gale and Peter and all the rest of it.
The examples that you gave are spot on. I think Voldemort is a great example because, like in the first 3 books, he's kind of this amorphous form. And it's not really until he appears like in his fully reincarnated body thing in book 4 that like we start to see other villains kind of slip away and not be as prominent. Like Draco's really important in book 1, not so much in the later books. Like he's still there, he's playing a role, but he's more of a conflicted character too, especially in the last book. So we get the sense that like the antagonism sort of, they pass the torch. Like we have the smaller villains early on, and then eventually Voldemort takes on that supervillain
mantle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Another scenario that occurred to me is sometimes villains are not villains. Like they're not people. Like they don't have agendas. Like I'm thinking about the shark in Jaws. Like it's just a shark. It's doing what sharks do. It's not being malicious. It's not trying to destroy the town. And so we need someone else to kind of fill the villain's shoes. And another example would be like in the Jurassic Park movies, like the dinosaurs are just doing what, genetically, artificially created dinosaurs would do in a given situation. But it's the scientists who created them. It's the people who are trying to manipulate these dinosaurs for their own means that are actually the bad guys. And so that kind of makes it more personal for the protagonists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you will find that in a lot of other genres as well. So like romance, you don't really have a villain. What you have is inner conflict. You have some kind of inner flaw, a lie that the character has told themselves or believes. And so, really, when we're talking about villains, we just mean, what is the driving conflict force? What is it? What is the biggest thing causing a problem in the book? And sometimes that is as internal as a wound from a character's past. And sometimes it's as external and macro as a government, a corrupt government. And sometimes it's not embodied. Sometimes it's an illness like a cancer, or like you said, Jaws is a great example of that. The thing is, when we talk about villains, so many people think of like the Sauron or the Voldemort or whatever.
Right.
But actually, what we mean is, what is the problem, the obstacle, the driving conflict force that is forcing your protagonist to change? Because, of course, if there were no conflict, we are habitual creatures. We don't really want to change. We like to stay in our comfort zone, right? So this conflicting, driving villain force is what forces the protagonist to change. And that's why it's so important that you are clear what your villain is, or who your villain is, or what you are connecting it to.
Love that. And I agree 100%. So let's dig in to talking about sort of bringing these characters to life. As you've already aptly mentioned, we don't do the same level of bringing to life with cameos and minor characters. But when it comes to the major supporting characters, one of the danger zones I always think is a character will kind of step in and take over the story and kind of snatch the story from the protagonist's hands, as it were. So how do we, as writers, give these characters the depth that they need, but then also do it in a way that doesn't completely change the story? I mean, Harry Potter is a great example. It could have been Hermione Granger and the Sorcerer's Stone or the Chamber of Secrets. Like, the fact that it's Harry as the protagonist, it could have been her story. You know what I mean? So like, it's interesting to me, like, how we can make these characters come to life and multidimensional without also completely going off the rails.
Okay, so there's a concept that I like to talk about called scene power. And you always know when the scene power is off because the protagonist isn't the one driving the scene. So I like to talk about this in terms of a dinner party. Hopefully all listeners have been to a dinner party before. Now, if you imagine that the host, the person whose house you've gone to, or the person who organized the dinner party, they are the protagonist. Now, if you imagine that all of the guests are the side characters and the supporting roles, now you can go into this dinner, and if you're observing this dinner, sometimes the guests are going to be the ones speaking, and they're going to be the center of attention because they're telling some, anecdote, or maybe they're leaning into the protagonist and asking some really philosophical, poignant question that's making the protagonist or the host think about something. Or maybe somebody's telling a story about the protagonist's past when they were a child and did that naughty thing that they got really told off for. But here's the difference, right? The side characters don't get to say when dinner gets served. The protagonist says, the host says, when the plates get cleared. They decide whether or not there's going to be a pudding. And it's the same in your scenes. Your side characters can come in, they can have the limelight for a little while, they can tell a story, they can have some anecdotes and all of this stuff, but they should never be the ones making the decisions that change the course of the story. They should never be the ones deciding whether you're going on plan A or plan B. That is the host's job. That is the protagonist's job. So this is one of the key ways that I like to think of side characters and the protagonist in terms of the amount of page time, the amount of control, the amount of power that a character has in the scene. In terms of making them come to life, I would say, how well do you know that character? How well can you verbalize their personality? Because it's in personality that we really see who they are. So, for example, if you have got a professor, an academic professor, right, that is something that would seep down into all of his personality. And you can represent that in the prose. You can represent that in how they speak. If you've got a professor, he's probably going to say things like, oh, well, in addition, I really do think that we ought to have a discussion about the concepts that were mentioned at, yada, yada, yada. Whereas if you have a gang member, they're probably going to be a bit more South London or, nah, mate, don't want to talk about that. Do you know what I mean? So you can represent their personality in the dialogue. You can represent their personality in the description. So with your academic professor, he's going to describe things with much longer words. That's going to represent his personality. He's probably going to use 2 or 3 sentences, whereas the gang member might use 1 word. And so these things representing the personality at the prose level and using those traits that you've put assigned to your characters and allowing those to influence the choices that you're making at the sentence level really helps to create that depth and that characterization.
It's interesting too. We could almost extend beyond dialogue as well and think about like the way the characters behave in the scene. I'm not talking like big behaviors, but like, sort of small mannerisms and nuances, sort of the way they present themselves. And then also the way they think through things, right? Like the way a professor thinks through a given situation is going to be very different from the way the gang member thinks through a situation. So I think there's that same example can sort of extend to many other domains as well that we can use to bring these characters to life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you've already mentioned that archetypes can be troublesome. I'm guessing that there are other pitfalls, other possible mistakes that writers might make when crafting their supporting characters. So can you give us like a couple of the biggies?
I think the first one we've probably covered in quite a lot of depth, which is getting the major, minor, and cameo wrong. So writers who have a selection of minor characters, but then try to give them subplots and character arcs. But then they don't really have enough depth or page time to really do those things justice. So that would be the first one, is to make sure that you're very clear who your cameos are, who your minor characters are, and who your major characters are. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail because we've obviously talked about it.
Right.
The second thing is probably thinking that you need really comprehensive character arcs. Now, unless you've got a character who's also a point of view character, they're getting equal amounts of page time. So like romance is a good example where this won't necessarily apply because quite often they're dual point of view and you only have those 2. But in like like third person limited or first person, like young adult novel where you only have one character narrating, writers will often try and give really super comprehensive character arcs for all of the major characters, when really what you need to do is create the illusion of an arc. And how do you do that? So obviously you need to know the what are their 2 states? So what is their beginning state and what is their end state and how are those different? And then you need something in the middle that sort of shows them trying to grapple with that problem. So I guess if we use the Hermione, we know at the beginning that she really wants to get good grades, that she wants to pass all her exams. We know at the end that none of them really go back and finish school, do they? But anyway, you know that she has passed a lot of her exams. You know that she took extra lessons. And then you see her grappling in the middle. That's this time turner kind of subplot where she's grappling with trying to be a good friend and trying to keep the secret of the time turner, as well as trying to do all her exams and the additional learning that she's doing. And then, of course, you need to show like that scene, like at the end where you have the conclusion to that. Whereas with the protagonist, you're going to see every single point along the way of that journey. You're going to see the sort of 2 steps forward. There's an obstacle. Oh, now I've learned a lesson. Oh, no. Retreat back into my old ways. Then another step forward. Oh, there's an obstacle. Now you've learned another lesson. And, sort of this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Whereas with side characters, you don't get as much depth. And certainly not if you're writing, I guess, kind of like standalones. Of course, like in a series like Harry Potter, we have a bit more page time for each of these characters. And then I suppose the other one comes back to something else that we were talking about earlier, which is not having a reason for existing outside the protagonist. And I just think that causes flat characters because they come into the story, they exist solely for the protagonist. And so you don't see any other aspects of them. Whereas the minute you create something that they want outside of the protagonist, they have other things to talk about. They have other things that give them meaning that detract from whatever it is the protagonist wants and therefore causes problems or helps.
I think the Hermione example is such a great example because we see sort of moments throughout the series where she kind of gets a little bit more attention, right? Like the troll scene in the first book.
Yeah.
But that she's kind of instigates the whole scenario sort of unwittingly that gets the three of them to become friends. Then the whole part about like her being called names in the second book. And then she's one of the victims of the basilisk and she's able to solve the problem, even though she's frozen, which I think is just hilarious that she helps Ron and Harry, even when she is like incapacitated. And the time turner, it's almost like the character just pops up when like that piece of story that attaches to the character comes up when that theme becomes relevant or that thematic element becomes relevant in the story and sort of ties to the bigger story. But then we might not see a whole lot of Hermione's backstory otherwise. So yeah, I think that's just such a great example. And it's a good way of thinking about how you might flesh out the protagonist versus a major supporting character where they're kind of more like dots, whereas like the protagonist is sort of like a line.
Exactly. And with the protagonist, you see they go through these obstacles, like let's just say it was the basilisk or whatever. And then you have that reflection afterwards. So you see in prose the thought process and that struggle between the old way and the flawed bit of that character, and then the lesson that they've learned and the reflection and the realization that they're having. Like you get to see that brain process and that thought in the protagonist, whereas you mostly just see the before state for the side character, then you see the action in the obstacle, and then you see the after state. And you only get any of that more reflective side if the protagonist has some kind of interaction or conversation with that side character afterwards.
Right. Like we have those moments where Harry, Hermione, and Ron are chatting like after the fact, like, do you really think he's coming back? Or he's,
yes,
like we wouldn't see that if it was just Ron and Hermione, or if it was Hermione by herself. But because it's Harry's there, then it becomes relevant to sort of the longer thread of the story.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So I feel like you and I could talk about supporting characters and the craft of writing until the cows come home. But in the interest of time, I figure we should wrap things up. So before we do that, tell us what's next for you. What do you want to share with our listeners?
So I have just released an audiobook, which is all about villains. It's the first book. I am going to be working on self-narrating the audio for the others. I'm also running masterclasses. So I have one link to my Patreon, where we will choose a book as a group and then we'll read it together, and I dissect and break down all of the things that the author has done. So the tools, the techniques they've used, we look at like the character arc or the romance, whatever element it is that the author's done well, we will look at that and break it down so that the group has tangible tools, tips and tricks to go away with. And then I'm also, next year, I will be running masterclasses on different things, be it I just ran one on villains, it could be on voice, it could be on description, all kinds of stuff. And then in terms of the next book, I am not sure. I have started 2 nonfiction books and I'm not sure which one I want to go with. And I'm trying to finish off some fiction at the moment. So I'm kind of letting this space and time and gap just let me decide which one is pulling me the more. So I don't know in terms of that yet.
It sounds like you have a lot going on regardless. So like, yeah. I don't even know how you have time to write the books in addition to all the masterclasses and everything else. And for our listeners who want to learn more about Sasha, we are putting the link in the show notes page. So check that out. So I always like to end with the same question. What's your number one tip for writers?
Oh, this is so hard. Like, I was like, this is so mean. I know I listened to so many of the episodes trying to see what sort of intelligent things people were saying. And it comes down, I think, to a lesson I learned this year, which is know thyself. And the reason I am saying know thyself is because I think the best books that we write are the ones that are the truest to us and to ourselves and to our lives. And I think when we are younger, we don't necessarily know ourselves or we don't know our whole selves. And so I am finishing off my fiction series and I am leaving it. And I'm going off to write a completely different genre because I feel like I am embracing like LGBT fiction and embracing that side of myself. And it kind of came from like a realization of reading LGBT books and how much of a connection I had in a way that I didn't have to books that were written with non-LGBT characters. And so I think when we can accept these parts of ourselves and we know ourselves, we can write books that are truer, that are realer, and that have more depth than anything else that we have done before. And I think it also makes us happier rather than writing something to market, or not that there's anything wrong with that, but writing what we think people want rather than what makes us happy. So know thyself.
Such great advice. Thank you so much, Sasha, for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
All right, word nerds, thanks so much for listening. Keep writing and keep being awesome.